is a CBS News report. I'm John Dickerson with Nora O'Donnell in Washington. Former President George Herbert Walker Bush's casket will soon depart for his final trip to Washington. We're waiting for the motorcade carrying Mr. Bush and members of his family to arrive at Ellington Field Joint Reserve Base in southeast Houston in just a few minutes.
There will be a short service there before the president and his family depart. One of the planes that normally serves as Air Force One will carry the former president to Joint Base Andrews, which is just outside Washington, D.C. We saw the Bush family. They gathered, it was about an hour ago, at a Houston funeral home to escort the 41st president to the airfield. Chip Reed is there at Ellington Field. Chip, good morning.
Well, good morning, Nora. You can see behind me the honor guard is ready for this ceremony to begin. You can also see what we all know as Air Force One, but it's only technically Air Force One when the current president is aboard. That is the same plane that just brought President Trump back from the G20 conference in Argentina. He authorized it to turn around and head here for this very special mission, which is being called Special Air Mission 41 in honor of the 41st president. At this ceremony, which will happen in just a moment, there will be a military honor guard that will very carefully and, of course, with military precision, move the casket from the hearse in the motorcade onto the plane. There will also be a 21-gun salute. President George W. Bush will be here on the tarmac with former First Lady Laura Bush, also several other members of the President Bush's family, and, of course, Sully, the dog that brought tears to so many people's eyes. It has been President Bush's service dog ever since his wife Barbara passed away earlier this year, and we all saw that photograph of Sully lying vigil in front of the president's flag-draped casket yesterday. Really an amazing sight, and Sully will join the Bush family for the flight back to Washington, D.C. to Joint Base Andrews, where a motorcade will then take him to the U.S. Capitol, where he will lie in state until Wednesday, when there will then be a memorial service at the National Cathedral. And on Wednesday evening, he will then fly back here to Houston, where there will be a funeral service, and then a train will take him from Houston to College Station to Texas A&M University and the President George H.W. Bush Presidential Library, where there will be a private burial service on Thursday. Nora?
All right, Chip Reed there at Ellington Field, and you can see hundreds of local officials and friends and family have gathered there for a send-off to the 41st president of the United States. We're told they're elected officials from the city, county commissioner, also people from the Points of Light Foundation, the Second Baptist Church there as well, many of the staff there, just people who wanted to be there and say goodbye. The military honor guard there as well, members from every service. President Bush, of course, served in the Navy during World War II, and that's why we say this is the last president of the greatest generation. I noted that the U.S. Navy tweeted when the president passed, "Fair winds and following sea, sir, we have the watch," which was beautifully said. And see, it's a windy day there at the airfield. He will be met there by his son, President George W. Bush, and Laura Bush, who will also greet the other members of the family. This ceremony, everything from what you see right there at Ellington Field to what we will see in Washington when he lies in state, to what's at the National Cathedral, to his burial, all being organized by Major General Michael Howard. He is actually the commanding general of the Joint Force headquarters in the National Capital Region. And he said that this whole ceremony that we're going to watch is the culmination of years of planning and rehearsal to ensure the support the military renders President Bush is, in his words, nothing less than a first-class tribute. And so we get to watch this historic goodbye over the next couple of days. And in some ways, as someone said to me, this is not just saying goodbye to a man, but in many ways an ideal that he represented, John.
Well, we don't, you know, we know what the inaugurations look like. We know what State of the Unions. We know what these, in politics, these moments are like. This is a fresh And yet, in a sense, it's also re-upping basic American values that he stood for: service, duty, honor, and that is not just wrapped up in a presidency. We know about the family, the way George Herbert Walker Bush was raised and the way he raised his children, that those are wrapped into the family themselves. And so this is a national story, but it's also a personal family story that contains all of the things that are being celebrated and honored by those honor-guarded attention and by the flags waving.
So I'll just jump in on the conversation here. It's a moment of institutional appreciation as well, the presidency itself, and, as was mentioned a bit earlier, there are times in American history when we look back on a presidency differently than we did when the presidency ended. George Bush's presidency ended with a spectacular defeat in 1992. He'd won 426 electoral votes in '88. He won 168 just 4 years later. A complete elevator shaft.
In a three-way race against Bill Clinton
and Ross Perot. But his political future looked so much brighter mid-term of that first term of his presidency. What he ended up with seemed almost inconceivable. And for that reason, we've looked back, I think, unappreciatively at his presidency as a political failure, but as a policy and as a foreign policy management presidency stands the test of time. And moments like this, where the country says, wait a minute, what actually happened and what it endures. And these moments come out in institutional celebrations like this.
And they come out in the feet of the people who have walked to the edge of the tarmac to simply watch this happen, who feel some connection to the man, to the office, to the country, and there you see them standing, waiting and watching this unfold because of a connection that they have to their country, and just that physically walking, wanting to be there to witness this, really gets at something very fundamental about people in the connection to their.
And our colleague Bianna has talked about how Houston loved the Bush family. Before I came to Washington, my last newspaper job was at the Houston Post. I was there for 2 years, and I covered his election night celebration in 1988. It was the first time I'd ever been in the presence of the National Political Press Corps, a press corps I hoped at some point in my career to join. And I remember that night there was something interesting about it, because politics, we all know, can be somewhat hokey and have show demonstrations. And they kept trying to gin up the crowd with call and responses of George, Bush, and it never caught on. And one of the reasons it struck me then and strikes me now is because George H.W. Bush had many strengths, but he was not a political showman at any level. He wasn't a rhetorician. He sort of didn't do the whole, it's a presentation part of politics. He did the quieter, harder work of politics, which defined his presidency. But in those moments when either rhetoric or showmanship were called upon, he didn't really have it. But that didn't mean his community didn't love him, didn't mean that there wasn't something deeper about their appreciation of him. He just wasn't really good at the kind of hokier sides of politics.
You know, John Meacham, who is the president's biographer and has really written the definitive work.
Tremendous access to the family and to the H.W. Bush.
He had this anecdote about how Bush, his nickname was called the have-half, because as a kid he would take a candy bar or a cookie and cut it in half and give the half to the other kid. It's almost hard to believe any child doing that, certainly with a candy bar or a cookie. But I think his actions, the president's actions in many years, make that story so believable, concerned about the other. And that was forged, in many ways, I think, by his initial military service.
Well, sure. And remember, when you say the greatest generation, part of that greatest generation is not just World War II, it's the Depression before that, and that sense of scarcity. And that sense of, if not privation, we're not certain what the future is going to hold, either economically or geopolitically. The Great Depression and World War II, formative events for everyone from that generation. And that have-half is like, I've got to take care of the person next to me because we're not sure we're going to get through this together.
Major, what we're seeing here is the motorcade is making its way to the ceremony, and so we expect it to begin shortly. The beginning of the slightly more, about 3.5-hour flight back to Washington, D.C., to Joint Base Andrews, where as President Bush would have landed after all of those campaign stops, all of those whirlwind tours across the world, both as president and as vice president.
And as the Bush family arrives and will be greeted there by former President George W. Bush, we should note that when they reach Washington, after a brief ceremony in Washington, the 41st president will lie in state. And so anyone who wants to go can go to the Capitol Rotunda and wait in line, and it'll be open all night. And you can have a look at the president's casket, which I still think is really just one of the most amazing things, you know, to think about. It started with President Lincoln and continues to this day for our presidents and special members of Congress like John McCain, who just lied in state, but really a remarkable thing that you can go do that. And so everyone has the opportunity to say goodbye.
And it's a touchstone moment. I remember when Ronald Reagan passed away. I was obviously a reporter in Washington, but I took my children and we stood in line. I didn't cut the line. It was 3.5 hours. And it's a touchstone moment when you walk in the Rotunda, that most spectacular architectural space in all of Washington, and it's completely silent, and you make one pass around, and then you walk back outside, and you feel, as an American citizen, you've touched something that is unique and enduring and beautiful about our country.
As we see the cars of the motorcade here, this is the way when you're president, the motorcades arrive like this on the tarmac, and the echoes that must be going through for the Bush family as they've been a part of these processions onto that famous plane, as a part of the president's service, as a part of his son's service. And now echoing for the last trip to Washington.
Every detail of this ceremony planned perfectly for the former commander-in-chief. And that's why, of course, the military honor guard there, and we will hear from them shortly, the Army Band, as well as a full departure ceremony as well.
And it's worth noting that this is a political dynasty, but a quiet one. I mean, think about it. Prescott Bush, senator from Connecticut. George Herbert Walker Bush, son a president, another son a governor of an enormously important state. And yet, it's not like Camelot, like this huge radiating family dynasty. And yet it is. It's quiet. It's been a part of American politics for decades. And as you said, Nora, this family links arms, tight, loving, and also very, very careful about all details and the best presentation possible of this moment, this legacy, which is at the top right now of this family's enduring political legacy throughout the country.
You see this motorcade essentially circling the tarmac, and what is Air Force One that Chip just pointed out just came all the way from Argentina and back to Houston to make this journey. That is the hearse carrying the 41st president of the United States. The family will be escorted from the motorcade to a position near the hearse by Major General Howard. He's the general I mentioned earlier who is in charge of this entire state funeral and pacing out everything that we're going to see over the next couple of days with military precision. And just to let everyone know what we're about to see as well is a full honors will be rendered, including 4 ruffles and flourishes and a hail to the chief with a simultaneous 21-gun salute. And we will stop talking when that happens because we all want to witness that. We're also learning more about the funeral service that will take place at the National Cathedral in Washington. That happens on Wednesday. We've learned that his oldest son, former President George W. Bush, will speak at that service, and former First Lady Laura Bush and their daughter Jenna will give readings. There will also be remembrances from 3 great friends of the 41st president, former Republican Senator Alan Simpson of Wyoming, who we know will be fun to hear from. He's got lots of good stories, always does. Mr. Bush's biographer, John Meacham, who is also not only a beautiful writer but speaker, and the former Canadian Prime Minister, Brian Mulroney. That will happen at the National Cathedral, where we most recently saw tributes to Senator John McCain. And we see now the hearse pulling up to what is being called Special Air Mission 41. On what looks like a very windy day in Houston. The honors will be rendered shortly for our former commander-in-chief, who enlisted when he was just 18 years old, becoming one of the youngest, if not the youngest, Navy pilot to fly during World War II, flying 58 combat missions and almost dying in one where two of his crewmates passed away. And he has thought about that his whole life, according to his biographer, the two crew members who were lost during World War II. you see the Bush family led by former President George W. Bush and First Lady Laura Bush leading the family onto Special Air Mission 41 after his father's casket was placed on the plane. And this really begins what is a several-day tribute to the former commander-in-chief and his more than 70 years of service to our country.
And you see there the former president waving from the top of the stairs, just as he would have done so many times getting into that plane as president to board. I mean, think of the resonances of this, to board the plane that his father also, the passenger number one on Air Force One, his casket is on. I mean, the echoes, they just continue throughout this moment.
I mean, this speaks to the dynasty of the Bush family, but also just how unique that moment is. The son walking up the stairs as he did before, literally following in the footsteps of his father, politically and for a time as the commander-in-chief of this country, both aboard Air Force One for this final journey. It is as poignant and, as you mentioned, John, resonant as anything you could see in modern-day American politics.
And testament to the size of the Bush family and the friends in Houston is the long line of those joining onto the plane.
In President George H.W. Bush's final moments, he was able to speak to his family. Some were there in the room. George W. Bush was on the phone, and the last words spoken were, "I love you."
Right. And as anyone who's ever been through this craves, you want a loved one, particularly a parent, to die peacefully, without pain, and surrounded by all whom can be with that loved one. Everyone hopes. It's a constant refrain and yearning in human experience, and for this family, and for that moment, and the country can take some measure of peace in that, precisely as you might want it to have happened.
I asked George W. Bush, what's the most important thing your father taught you? And he said the most important thing he ever said to me was, "I love you," unconditional love. And for those two men who have occupied that Oval Office and know the challenges of occupying that office and leading the country, we are watching the departure ceremony in Houston, Texas, at Ellington Field for the 41st President of the United States. His family there, a military honor guard that sent him off with 4 ruffles and flourishes and a "Hail to the Chief" and the simultaneous 21-gun salute.
And the casket will fly from here to Joint Base Andrews, landing around 3:30-ish, and then it will be driven to the Capitol. And when it arrives there at the Capitol, there will be an arrival ceremony, and then a service at the Rotunda, and then the casket will lie in state, as Nora mentioned. Anybody can go and pay their respects.
And at the Capitol Rotunda will not only be James Baker, his best friend, who was there with him at the end, holding his hand and rubbing his feet, but also Vice President Dan Quayle will also be there in the Rotunda, as well as former members of President Bush's cabinet to greet him when he arrives at the U.S. Capitol. I was reminded in reading again about his biography that he had run for the Senate twice and lost in Texas, and then was elected to Congress. Just one of the many things that former George H.W. Bush did. He lost in politics many times.
Persevered many times. Had many disappointments. Times he thought something was going to be teed up and he got consolation prizes, awkward consolation prizes at times. And that shows you his dimension of perseverance about not only public service, but his own ambition. They sometimes go together. It's all right to say it out loud. You can be a public servant and be ambitious at the same time, and he was. And he achieved the presidency in part because of that perseverance and that unwillingness to give in or give up after setbacks.
And it was connected, that loss, that ability to come back after setbacks, connected also to his other quality, which is forgiving those who he had competed with, including Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, who beat him in 1980 in the primaries, and then he went on to be his vice president.
Went on to be his vice president, succeeded him at that convention in 1988 in New Orleans, essentially telling Republican delegates, I'll be the third term of the Reagan presidency. When his third term wasn't like the Reagan presidency, it became a disappointment and a political vulnerability for him within the Republican Party.
Chip Reed is there at Ellington Field. Chip?
Nora, we just saw an extraordinary ceremony. You could have heard a pin drop here if it hadn't been for this incredible wind going on. But I've seen that ceremony so many times, or ceremonies similar around the country and at the U.S. Capitol on many occasions. And it always puts a wrenching in your gut to see it. They do it with military precision, as you have mentioned, and that is to honor the people who are involved in this case. Former President George H.W. Bush. You saw quite a few members of the Bush family get on the plane, along with Sully, the president's service dog, who will be given to a military family when he gets back to Washington, D.C. It's about a 3.5-hour flight back to Washington. There will be a ceremony at Joint Base Andrews and then on to the U.S. Capitol, where he will lie in state until Wednesday. Then there will be a memorial service, and then he will come back here to Houston, and he will be taken by train after a funeral service from here to College Station, Texas. It's a special train outfitted just for this occasion. As you mentioned earlier, Nora, they've been planning this for quite some time, and everything is planned up to every meticulous second of this is planned. And there will then be a private burial ceremony on Thursday at the Presidential Library at College Station, Texas. Nora?
Oh, Chip, and beautiful to see that train that is going to take him to his final resting place, and incredible. There you see it. I can imagine
those colors never look bad. They just don't.
They don't.
Air Force One is the most spectacular plane. We've all had a chance to fly it. It is the most beautiful plane to get off, to get on, and to be under the wing of, waiting for the president to come down. And that characteristic wave at the top of the stairs. It's a wave to the country. It's a wave to the world. It's a wave about what America means. And the plane and the train and all those places are symbols of that.
I'm reminded of something from President George H.W. Bush's inauguration speech, where he said, "We are not sums of our possessions. They are not the measure of our lives. In our hearts, we know what matters. We cannot hope only to leave our children a bigger car, a bigger bank account. We must hope to give them a sense of what it means to be a loyal friend, a loving parent, a citizen who leaves his home, his neighborhood, and his town better than he found it."
Not just words.
He was a loving friend and a dear friend to so many, and he did that by his personal phone calls, his notes, his handwritten notes. People would say he wrote handwritten notes for handwritten notes. Thank you.
Well, and the people lined there to see him, as they will be lined up for the next several days, including when that train makes its final trip, are testament to just exactly what you just read, Nora, that his life succeeded in fulfilling what he talked about.
His friendship, I mean, his marriage, 73-year marriage with Barbara Bush, what an incredible partnership. Susan Page has a book coming out that will talk about a biography of the former First Lady. That relationship so incredibly meaningful. His relationship with his children, his 6 children, one who passed away at the age of 3, his grandchildren.
And there you hear the engines of Air Force One getting ready to move.
As many presidents have remarked when they left office, the thing that they will miss most in some ways is this plane. It's
literally unforgettable. There's no ride like it. There just isn't. And anyone privileged enough in any capacity to ride that jet never forgets it.
And this in a somber moment, but the whole family on board. Think about that. Although Marvin Bush, one of his sons, and his wife will greet them when they land in Washington at Andrews Air Force Base. And The team at Andrews Air Force Base that has served many presidents knows the Bush family very well. It is a family.
Sure.
It is a family.
And the stories they no doubt will recount of being in that plane at various stages of their various lives, when George W. Bush was a much younger man visiting with his father, and then George W. Bush's children. That plane has been one in which they have experienced the different stages of their lives that they are in now, and I'm sure they have some tales to tell about their time on it.
And remarking about the Bush family and the Bush marriage, as we all remember, in the '92 campaign, this question of values, family values, what they represented, how resonant they were in late 20th century America. Were they changing? Was that change bad for the country? Did what the Bush family represent fit within those changing times, or was it somehow out of step with these changing times? That's a question that's still not completely answered, but as we look back on this family, that was an enduring part of that greatest generation, that post-World War II approach to not just work life, but family life. It's changed in many dimensions since then, and the passing of George H.W. Bush is a marker in that transition in our country about all sorts of values, how they're articulated, how they're lived through, and how the country comes to appreciate them in their many different dimensions and definitions.
President George H.W. Bush, the last president of the greatest generation, and his friends in Houston there to say a final goodbye. And we honor these presidents and talk about them because the history is extraordinary. And he had one term in office as president, but 2 terms as Vice President Reagan. And looking back on him, many will say that he was the most prepared man in history to hold that office. You know, a Navy pilot, an oilman, a congressman, a diplomat, head of the CIA, head of the Republican National Committee
at a very tough time,
a vice president. He had an extraordinary, extraordinary career of service.
And, you know, the ceremony we've seen, and this plane, and the symbols of American government, wrapped into that is this idea of service. And at one point, George Bush was talking about his service, and when he was asked to be CIA director, he talked about the values, and he said one of those values that he had been raised with, quite simply, is that one should serve his country and his president. And so if that is what this president wants me to do, the answer is a firm yes. And that's the automatic yes that you give. And that is really wrapped up in the ceremony that we're watching right now, the automatic yes to your country.
And Special Air Mission 41 is set to depart Houston, Texas, returning to the nation's capital, where the president will lie in state. President George W. Bush said that his father knew that the office is more important than the man, and that one of the jobs of the President of the United States is to strengthen the institution of the presidency and to bring honor to the office. And there is agreement. He did bring, I think, honor to the office. Even if you disagreed with his policies, he served honorably.
And the reason to honor the office and be a steward of it is for moments like this, is that because there's a continuity in the system that is built into the office, and you know that you are a temporary steward of it, and that it endures and has endured for a long time.
Well, and also you hold the role as commander-in-chief, and protecting the nation, and hold the lives of men and women in your hands and the decisions you make along with your cabinet. And that is one of the most solemn responsibilities of the commander-in-chief.
And the pressures are relentless. The pressures are constant day to day in the presidency. And one of the things that fortified H.W. Bush's approach to the presidency and his sons was history will judge this over time. I will not concern myself as acutely with the judgments of the moment as the judgments of time.
James Baker, his best friend, who served in multiple capacities in the administration, said that the world changed under George H.W. Bush. It did. It saw the end of the Cold War, where America became the lone superpower. Barack Obama told us at CBS News that the president didn't spike the football at that moment, that he dealt with it with humility. That changed the course of history.
Even though some wished he had spiked the ball, there was a sense that we could have this national moment of triumphalism, and he did not indulge either himself, the institution, or the country in that moment of triumphalism for strategic long-term reasons.
And there you see everyone's camera and iPhone up to record this moment. We all become, I'm reminded by the iPhone, as someone once told me, that we all now are journalists in some ways. We can record history in different ways. And the departure as well of the Military Honor Guard. And now Special Air Mission 41 makes the journey to Washington, D.C., where there will be an elaborate ceremony on Capitol Hill for President George H.W. Bush, where he will lie in state. And there will be more elected officials, names from history, that if you're a history buff, you will recognize many people that served in his cabinet, and Ronald Reagan before that, who will all be there. Vice President Quayle will be there as well on Capitol Hill, all to welcome him to lie in state and pay tribute. Because starting tonight through all the way through tomorrow, you can pay a visit.
And take a measure of the moment.
We should note that coverage of President George H.W. Bush will continue throughout the day on your local news, on this CBS station, and on our 24-hour streaming network, CBSN. Also, watch it at cbsnews.com. We're going to have another special report this afternoon from Washington when the former president arrives to lie in state at the U.S. Capitol. And there's going to be a full wrap-up tonight on the CBS Evening News with Jeff Glor. This has been a CBS News special report. Major Garrett, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm Norah O'Donnell with John Dickerson, CBS News, Washington.